This book is The Story of Ruby Bridges by Robert Coles, illustrated by George Ford. This recording is for free educational purposes only. Ruby Bridges was born in a small cabin near Tylertown, Mississippi. "We were very poor, very, very poor," said Ruby. "My daddy worked picking crops. We just barely got by. There were times when we didn't have much to eat. The people who owned the land were bringing in machines to pick the crops, so my daddy lost his job, and that's when we had to move. I remember us leaving. I was 4, I think." In 1957, the family moved to New Orleans. Ruby's father became a janitor. Her mother took care of the children during the day, but after they were tucked into bed, she went to work scrubbing floors in a bank. Every Sunday, the family went to church. "We wanted our children to be near God's Spirit," Ruby's mother said. At that time, black children and white children went to separate schools in New Orleans. The black children were not able to receive the same education as the white children. It wasn't fair, and it was against the country's law. In 1960, a judge ordered 4 black girls to go to 2 white elementary schools. 3 of the girls were sent to one school, and 6-year-old Ruby Bridges was sent to first grade in the William Franz Elementary School. Ruby's parents were proud that their daughter had been chosen to take part in an important event in American history. They went to church. "We sat there and prayed to God," Ruby's mother said, "that we'd all be strong and have courage and we'd get through any trouble. And Ruby would be a good girl and she'd hold her head up high and be a credit to her own people and a credit to all the American people. We prayed long and we prayed hard." On Ruby's first day, a large crowd of angry white people gathered outside the Franz Elementary School. The people carried signs that said they didn't want black children in a white school. People called Ruby names, and some wanted to hurt her. The city and state police did not help Ruby. The President of the United States ordered federal marshals to walk with Ruby into the school building. Every day for weeks, that turned into months, Ruby experienced that kind of school day. She walked to school surrounded by marshals. Wearing a clean dress and a bow in her hair and carrying her lunch pail, Ruby walked slowly for the first few blocks. As Ruby approached the school, she saw a crowd of people marching up and down the street. Men and women and children shouted at her. They pushed toward her, but the marshals kept them from Ruby by threatening to arrest them. Ruby would hurry through the crowd and not say a word. The white people in the neighborhood would not send their children to school. When Ruby got inside the building, she was all alone except for her teacher, Mrs. Henry. There were no other children to keep Ruby company, to play with and learn with, or to eat lunch with. But every day Ruby went into the classroom with a big smile on her face, ready to get down to the business of learning. She worked well at her desk, Mrs. Henry said. She enjoyed her time here. She didn't seem nervous or scared. She seemed as normal and relaxed as any child I've ever taught. So Ruby began learning how to read and write in an empty classroom and an empty building. "Sometimes I'd look at her and wonder how she did it," said Mrs. Henry. "How she went by those mobs and sat there all by herself and yet seemed so relaxed and comfortable." Mrs. Henry would ask Ruby if she was okay, and Ruby kept saying that she was doing fine. But her teacher worried that she might get scared and not want to come to school anymore. Then one morning something happened. Mrs. Henry stood by a window in her classroom and watched Ruby walk toward the school. Suddenly, Ruby stopped right in front of the group of howling and screaming people. She stood there facing all of these men and women. She seemed to be talking to them. Mrs. Henry saw Ruby's lips moving, and wondered what Ruby could be saying. The crowd seemed ready to kill her. The marshals were worried. They tried to persuade Ruby to move along. They tried to hurry her into the school, but Ruby wouldn't budge. Then Ruby stopped talking and walked into the school. When Ruby went inside, Mrs. Henry asked her what had happened. She told Ruby she had seen her stop and talk with the people. "I didn't stop and talk with them," Ruby said. "Ruby, I saw your lips moving," said Mrs. Henry. "I wasn't talking," said Ruby. "I was praying. I was praying for them." Every morning, Ruby had been stopping a few blocks away from school to say a prayer for the people who hated her. This morning she forgot until she was already in the middle of them. When school was over for the day, Ruby hurried past the people. When she was a few blocks away and the crowd was behind her, she said the prayer that she had been saying twice a day, before and after school. "Please, God, try to forgive these people, because even if they say those bad things, they don't know what they're doing. So if you could forgive them, just like you did those folks a long time ago when they said terrible things about you." Later that year, 2 white boys joined Ruby at the Franz Elementary School. Their parents were tired of seeing the boys get into mischief around the house when they could have been in school and learning. The people outside the school became very angry when they saw the first white students went back to school. But those boys were soon joined by other children. By the time Ruby was in 2nd grade, the angry people had given up their fight to scare her away and get rid of the law that said that all children should go to school together. Ruby graduated from elementary school. She went to high school. She married a building contractor and had 4 sons of her own, and was a successful businesswoman. This is what her mother said about Ruby. "Our Ruby taught us all a lot. She became someone who helped change our country. She was part of history, just like generals and presidents are part of history. They're leaders, and so was Ruby. She led us away from hate, and she led us nearer to knowing each other, the white folks and the black folks."